Hi, I'm Josh McGrath,
I'm Andrew Haas.
and this is the Ardent Pursuit Podcast. Welcome back. As we've discussed before, 60% of men in the US aged 18 to 30 are single. And for many of those men, they don't even have an interest in being married. What does this mean? Well, it means that there are a lot of single women, many of whom want to be married, but aren't being pursued romantically because guys just aren't pursuing them. We want to examine the impact that this has, and it's important for men to be aware of the way that this influences how women think and approach relationships. Because men, believe it or not, women think and approach relationships differently than you. And so today we're going to examine 5 reasons why a woman may say no to being romantically pursued. Now, in episode 14, we actually discussed a brief idea of how a woman can say no to a first date, right? And you may go on that first date, and if men, you're following the rubric we've given you, you've gone on that first date, and now you want to ask if you can romantically pursue her. And for women, it's important to note that a lot of the principles as far as how to, process saying yes or no to a first date can be applied when it comes to saying yes or no to a romantic relationship. However, what we're going to do right now is we're going to examine 5 reasons that, Andrew and I have observed over the years why a woman may say no to a romantic pursuit of her. So let's dive in here. Andrew, what is number 1?
So, right off the bat, he might not be a great guy, or you just have no interest in him. Seems straightforward.
Yeah, there's a lot of not great guys out there who are trying to pursue women. And so if he's got all the red flags, you know what is a good thing to do as a woman? Say no, shut it down.
And we'll touch on this a little bit later, but something to recognize is what makes a guy great at 20 years old is going to be much less as far as standards than what makes a guy great at 30 or 40 years old.
Yes, because our values mature with us, or at least they should.
Yes, they should.
So yes, at 30, what you're looking for will be quite different than what you're looking for at 20. Now, the other aspect of this is a guy you may just not be interested in. Another reason why a woman may say no, she's not interested in him, which is totally okay. There's a lot of guys out there that women are not going to be interested in. However, I want to just note that if you're a woman who really wants to be married and there's a guy who's pursuing you who you're not interested in, there is value in going to your authority and accountability and asking them whether this is someone you should consider being interested in. I think about, David and Caitlin's story, right? It was a mutual friend that came to them individually and said, hey, you guys should go on a date. You guys should get together. And what sometimes happens culturally is we buy into a belief, that Hollywood, romance novels and chick flicks sell us that it should be all rainbows, roses, and unicorns. There should be sparks flying everywhere. But, you actually may need to cultivate a spark.
Yeah, well, because think about it, interest is, there's a spectrum. And it could be anything from, you see a picture, right? One end of the spectrum is a picture of the person.
Sure.
That'll spark interest.
Yep.
The other end is you might know them for years. And somewhere in the middle there, interest has to start somewhere.
Yes.
And we often will bring our own preconceived ideas of where interest should start. And just be willing to reevaluate that. We might think interest is supposed to start here, when really it could start here. At least be open to the idea.
Or how it should look. How should interest look? And so we do have this preconceived notion that, well, the way my interest will look is obviously, my heart flutters every time I see him. And, he's looking at me, I'm looking at him, we're sending each other little handwritten notes. Obviously that's the way it's going to work out. It's like, well, maybe. Or maybe it's one of those things where you have no interest in him at all. And that's okay to start there because guess what? You wouldn't be the first couple to do that. There are many, many successful marriages today where when you hear their story, it was I didn't like him at all. I had no interest in him. I didn't even know he existed. And that's okay. You can start there. And we'll unpack this more when we get to point number 3.
And it's good to remember, just to be clear, that if there's a guy that you're friends with and there's no interest, that's totally fine. Just don't rule out the possibility that interest could develop.
Yeah, excellent point. So point number 2 here is the maturity paradox.
Great name.
A great name. So what is the maturity paradox? Well, as we've covered here on the show before, women statistically mature faster than men. And overall, women tend to steward their resources better than men. And so as a woman ages, she's going to steward her giftings, her talents, and her time in a way where she's actually now like an elite kind of woman, where her standards for the type of man she would allow to pursue her is now even more heightened, is even more elite, which means that already there's a decreased number of men interested in marriage. Now, even out of those who are interested, she's like, no, he has to be this very, very high standard. Why? Because she's spent, 10 or 20 years cultivating her giftings and talents, and she's probably financially successful. She's probably got a great career. She's probably got great influence. Mm-hmm. And so now the type of man that she would entertain has to meet her standard.
It's important to recognize that men will mature outside of marriage, but it is actually harder. And it's really hard to mature to a point where a woman would find you interesting. Mm-hmm. And so women need to recognize that the maturity that you're often looking for often results from being married.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate that guys really need to be intentional about maturing on their own. Marriage forces it on you, mm-hmm. So that's a nice benefit, if you will. But as a single guy, you've got a purpose to do that on your own.
Yeah, the maturity paradox is such that a woman who is being responsible and growing and stewarding, actually it becomes more difficult for her to get married, mm-hmm. which is it's a really unfortunate reality. And of course, we're not saying women don't steward your resources, time, and talent. Absolutely, you should be doing that. But recognize that in doing so, the type of guy that you're going to be interested in is going to be an elite kind of man, and it's going to be harder to find him.
Yeah, not a bad thing. Just recognize that that's how life plays out.
And this is why it's so much easier to get married when you're young, when you're in your early 20s.
Yeah, half the time you don't even know like what your preferences are, or what your lifestyle is about, or what your routines are. As a young adult, you're still figuring all that out.
Yeah, you've got time to kind of in real time discover that together. Mm-hmm. And like you said with point number 1, what you're looking for, your criteria for what you're interested in at 20 is going to be different than at 30, 35, or 40. Mm-hmm. And so at 35, you're not going to be interested in kind of that 20-year-old bro. Whereas when you're 20 and the 20-year-old bro is pursuing you, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm head over heels in love. Why? Because your criteria is so different.
And it's good to recognize that as two people grow and mature separately outside of a relationship, the later you go in life, the more challenging it will be to overlap those lives in a relationship someday. Mm-hmm. That's a good thing to have a lifestyle, to have routines, to have habits, to live, you're living for something. Yeah. You know what your life is about. Great. But then having to merge that in a relationship someday just presents some difficulty.
It's true because, at 20, right? Everyone's poor at 20. Mm-hmm. So you're figuring out, all right, how do we spend money? How do we budget? You're trying to figure that out together. Whereas when you're 30, 35, 40, guess what? You've lived a decade or two as an adult where you know how you budget. You know where your spending priorities are. At 20, you're 22, 24, you don't really know how you do, your family traditions or holidays. You're figuring that out. So you can figure that out together in marriage. But by the time you're 35 or 40, again, you've spent a couple decades being like, no, this is how I celebrate these holidays. These are my family traditions. When I think about myself, I know how I like to travel. I know what that experience is like. Whereas at 20, I had no clue. I just up and moved to Korea for a summer. I was like, I don't know, let's do this. At 20, you can be figuring that out. At 35, you're like, no, this is how I do it. And so, like you said, it becomes harder to merge two independent lives that have lived, a couple decades stewarding well what they have. There's unique challenges that are presented there that you don't actually have at 20.
Yeah. The more you know what your life is about, by definition, it's going to be more challenging to find somebody that you can partner with.
So one of the reasons why a woman may say no to a man's romantic pursuit of her is simply because she's matured well. And so the criteria that she's looking for in the type of future spouse is not something she sees around her. And so she's saying no to him, which actually leads us into point number 3, which is titled the Little Red Hen effect. So what is this? The title comes from a story, a fable from Russia that was reprinted throughout the 1900s. And it's the story of the little red hen who wants to go make, I think it's a cornmeal bread or something. So she goes out to collect the corn and she asks the barnyard animals, will you help me collect the corn? And they say no. And so then she says, will you help me mill the corn? They say no. She says, will you help me make the bread? No. Will you help me bake the bread? No. And then she pulls it out of the oven and all the barnyard animals can smell the fresh bread. So they all come to her window and say, we'll help you eat the bread. And she was like, well, you weren't there when I got the corn, when I milled the corn, when I made the bread, when I baked the bread. No, you don't get any bread. And the story ends with her sitting down having her own bread. So how does this play out when it comes to a woman saying no? Well, there's this reality that for many women, as they mature, the criteria that they're looking for in a future spouse is derived from other married men that they're viewing around them, that they're looking at around them. So they're looking at these married men who have been married for 10, 15, 20 years, and they exhibit incredible fruit. They've got amazing characteristics and qualities that have been developed throughout marriage. And that single woman who has matured is saying, okay, I am identifying those things and saying those things I need to have in a man who wants to pursue me. But the single man who wants to pursue her cannot have those same character qualities, the fruit of the married man's life because they haven't been married.
By definition.
By definition. And so you end up in this really awkward situation where you've got these mature, high caliber women who are saying, well, the only type of men that I'm interested in are men that are like the guy who's been married for 20 years. But guess what? You can't get the guy who's been married for 20 years. That's not an option.
Yeah, and recognizing that the fruit that you see, the things that might make someone interesting, the characteristics that are interesting to you are often the result of a married life. Wives have a big influence in the refinement and growth of a husband.
Sure.
And that's a great thing. But it only comes through that process.
And so, again, at 20, the fruit that you're looking for in a potential spouse is going to be pretty different than at 35 or 40. At 35 or 40, now you're looking at, the guys who have been married for 20 years and saying that's the type of fruit. Whereas at 20, you're like, does he love Jesus and does he have a job?
So it'll be good to think about the criteria that might make someone interesting to you. Are the things that you are looking for in a guy, are they primarily the result of him being married? And if so, is it realistic to have those expectations on somebody who's unmarried?
That's a great point because when you're married, that forces a man into a 24/7 environment where he's got to, be self-sacrificing, where he needs to serve, where he needs to love, where he needs to give of himself, right? That 1 Corinthians, Paul the Apostle concept here. As a single guy, I have to intentionally place myself in environments where I can do the same thing. But at the end of the day, no matter how many times I try to place myself in those environments, I will never exude the same type of fruit that you have in your life because yours is 24/7. You have covenant. I get to go home and unplug. It's just me at home. I don't have a wife and kids that need my attention, that need my love, that need my energy, that need me to be selfless for them. And so for a woman, single woman who's looking to at a man who wants to romantically pursue her, if she's saying, well, he doesn't exude the same type of selflessness, the same type of love, the same type of care that this married father of 20 years does. I'm like, yeah, no duh. It's impossible. He does not have that demand placed upon him 24/7. That is the very nature and beauty of covenant, is that it develops men into gentlemen.
Yeah, and that's something to look forward to. And that's one of the expectations of marriage, is that you get to walk out that process and watch it happen as you live your life.
And, for women, they could be like, wait, so do I have to, I'm 35, I'm 40, whatever. Do I have to wait 20 years now for the guy that I'm interested in to end up being like that amazing, father and husband that I'm looking to, saying that's what I want? And the answer is hopefully no, because of the fact that you're both more mature, because of the fact that, you're at a later season in life, the things that you've got to, kind of stumble through and figure out in your 20s, you should be able to cover that fairly quickly in a series of conversations. And so maybe instead of it taking 20 years, you can do it in, 15, 10, or 5 years. So no, it doesn't, you don't have to wait 20 years. Absolutely not.
No.
But be aware of, what is the criteria that you're using when it comes to single men wanting to romantically pursue you?
Yeah, we could often want, I think the Army is a good example. A guy will go through boot camp and enlist, and through that process, you learn routine, you learn good habits, you learn hard work, diligence, respect, honor. The idea is that oftentimes we want a partner who has all of those characteristics, but they haven't gone through the process yet.
Yeah.
And so we see people who have gone through the process and say, oh, those are the characteristics I want. But by definition, someone who you are partnered with won't have those yet because they haven't gone through the process.
Yeah, the maturity paradox often leads to the little red hen effect. And so when there is a single guy approaching a woman, if you just reject him solely on the grounds that the fruit of his life doesn't look like the fruit of the man who's been married for 20 years, well, yeah, that's going to take time. And the maturity paradox often leads to the little red hen effect. And unfortunately, this disproportionately impacts women. And so that's just something to be aware of, both for women and for men.
And that leads us into our next point, the comfort zone effect. Something we need to be aware of is that we can get comfortable in where we are in life, our town, our routines, our life, our job, all of that.
Yep.
And comfort is not the problem.
Yep.
What can be the problem is the prioritization of comfort or the avoidance of things in our life that might disrupt the comfort.
Yes, it's so important that our listeners understand that we're not saying comfort is a bad thing, that comfort is sin, because it's not. And where you are, geographically, you might be there for a lot of good reasons, some of which you've stated already. And I'm going to add to that list things like, family, local church. So you're in these environments, maybe because of a job. You're in these great environments, possibly or likely very healthy, life-giving environments. But it's possible that by being in that particular environment, you are actually limiting the number of options available to you as a woman. There may not be people in your orbit that you are interested in or that are interested in you.
Be willing to step outside the comfort zone. Just be ready and willing to move beyond what you might expect for your life.
So, how does, the comfort zone effect cause a woman to say no to a man's interest? Well, I think there's a couple ways that this may play out. One is if she, through that comfort zone, she's become too comfortable with him and therefore actually does not have an interest whatsoever. Kind of going back to point number one. Because of that comfort, has said no to his overtures, to his interest in her. The second way that I think that this can play out is that she becomes too comfortable in the environment she's in. And so even a guy outside of her, immediate circle who may be interested in her, if he's not willing to conform to the lifestyle of comfort, again, this isn't a bad thing. Is it willing to maybe move to the hometown that she was born and raised in, or move next to her family, or attend the same local church she's going to, or whatever. She may rebuff his overtures because she's like, well, it would be a disruption to the comfort and arguably probably the health that she has there.
Yeah, we can often disqualify somebody who it might not be immediately clear how their life could overlap or overlay with our life. Again, to the comfort thing, if it's not immediately clear how that could work, we could often discount somebody.
Yeah. And that's, again, part of the whole, dating process is to really figure that out. And that's why you have accountability and authority involved in that process, because they're able to help guide you and offer wisdom as you're navigating that. And that, guess what, is just outside of, being in the same community, in the same church, having grown up on the same street, you're going to have to figure those things out.
And something to keep in mind, someone's life is very different than yours. And you might think, there's no way, our lives are so different. And maybe they are, and it doesn't go anywhere. At least be ready and willing for that to change, or at least be open to the idea that, yes, things could be very different. It's not a bad thing. But too often we'll prematurely disregard that simply because the differences are there.
It's true. All right, so point number 5, standards versus preferences.
So important. Standards are things that we need in our life. Preferences are things that we would like in our life. And it's good to be clear on the differences there. There could be some overlap, but too often we will filter people that we might be interested in first through the preferences. And then if they make it that far, we'll kind of hold them up to our standards. We probably eliminate prematurely some really good potential partners. And I think if we flip that around, first evaluate somebody through standards, and then see how they match up with your preferences.
And one of the reasons why we advocate that men and women have authority and accountability in their life is because authority and accountability can help you define whether your standards are actually standards and whether your preferences are actually preferences. And the reason that's important is because you should never compromise on your standards, but you should always be willing to compromise on your preferences.
At least be willing. And that can be challenging because we have our preferences and we like them and they're there for a reason, but compromising on preferences could actually be a really good thing.
Yes. And again, why you want authority and accountability involved in that process is because if you do compromise on your preferences and you enter into that romantic relationship, now you're relationally invested and it is easy to begin to compromise on standards because you think, well, I already compromised on these things, which were preferences. What's the big deal if I just compromise on a standard? And what can slowly happen is you begin to compromise on your standards, the things that you should never compromise on. And authority and accountability can be your eyes and ears to help guard you where you might tend to want to compromise on something so important as standards.
Yeah, you will not walk this out well on your own.
No.
You just won't.
No.
You won't. And so we are just terrible at self-evaluating our own preferences, our own standards. We have them, but actually holding them up to somebody and actually walking out life when feelings and subjectivity are introduced, you've got to have people along for that.
And if you really have a deep desire to be married, you're biased towards a specific outcome, which means you are more likely willing to do anything to make that outcome a reality.
And recognize that the more subjective you are, by definition, the less objective you are. And so you want to remain objective as long as you can, but when subjectivity is there, that's fine. Just have other people to help you walk through that.
One of the challenges with the standards versus preferences discussion is the fact that for many people, women and men, they actually sometimes think their preferences are standards because they've not clearly defined them. And particularly when it comes to the Christian world, the church environment, I think that sometimes the external qualities and talents that men possess within the church environment can be misconstrued to be assumed that that is a standard that they should have for any guy who's interested in them. I'm thinking about, all right, so take the church environment. A guy who's leading worship, that's awesome. A guy who's, running the children's ministry, he's in charge of the children's ministry, that's awesome. The guy who's getting up and giving exhortations in front of the whole church, who can communicate well, that's awesome. And so you can look at that and say, man, those are qualities that I need to have in a future spouse. When in reality, that is just the fruit of a man who is, stewarding the giftings and talents that he has. It's not necessarily indicative of more fruit than some guy who isn't in front of the church on Sunday morning, who isn't leading worship, who isn't running a children's ministry. Because the way that a guy stewards his giftings and talents, the way that a guy is solid in the Lord, will look different from person to person.
And oftentimes what happens too is, you might have certain preferences and certain things that you find desirable. And within marriage, you'll discover one of two things. Either those things end up not mattering much, or you get to be part of the process with that person to help those things become a reality.
Yeah, so there's a lot of, really solid men out there who, want to be married, but maybe they're, a little socially awkward. Maybe they're a little more quiet, a little more introverted. Maybe they're not the go-getter type of personality. And so they might try and, pursue a woman, but the woman says no because the preferences that they have and the external qualities of the guy aren't lining up. And so while he'd be an incredible provider, while he'd be committed and faithful, while he would adore her, she's going to say no because she's waiting for the guy who meets the criteria of her preferences, not realizing that those preferences actually aren't standards. The standards are the thing that she should not compromise on.
Yeah, so what we're saying is have preferences and have standards, just have them in the right order. Make sure you're prioritizing standards. Don't compromise on those. And then, to the extent that it makes sense, where the preferences line up, great.
And obviously, we're not saying, women go out and marry the first guy that's, solid, but has none of the preferences that you're looking for. Obviously, you do need to figure out, okay, what are my preferences and what ones am I willing to compromise on? And you need to do that within the realm of authority and accountability. The great thing about understanding this concept, though, is that when you know what your standards are, suddenly there are a lot more possibilities as far as eligible men that you could marry. Whereas if you don't understand what your preferences are, there are very few, if any, men out there that may actually meet all of your preferences.
Yep. And kind of by definition, preferences will likely change. It's new seasons, new opportunities, new things we experience. So don't get so set on them anyway, because in 5 years, 10 years, you'll probably have different preferences, at which point life will look quite different.
Definitely. So as we conclude here, men, why did we discuss these 5 things today? What are the takeaways for you? Well, 2 things. Number 1, it's important for you to recognize that men and women approach relationships from different perspectives, and you want to make sure that you're aware of that. And number 2, we want to enlarge your understanding for the way that women are processing relationships, in particular, how they're evaluating them and the criteria that they're oftentimes looking for. Now, as a final, just quick note here, man, I want to encourage you to not get stuck in the mindset that the woman has to be younger than you. There is definitely an opportunity to enlarge your orbit by looking at the women in your community, in your life, who are older than you. If you want to know more about that, sit down, talk with your authority and accountability on that. They will be able to provide you some great insight into processing that better. Well, we love having you here today. We're going to see you here next time, where we're going to continue our conversation to you men on what your next step should be based upon her response to your inquiry about can you romantically pursue her. We'll see you here next time.